All right, students, today we're going to get into Galatians chapter 4. Now, hopefully you've taken the challenge and you're reading through this with us, not just listening to the sermons, but you're reading through Galatians. And in chapter 4, the key word is going to be choice. Paul's going to talk about making choices. And he's really going to challenge the Galatians that they're going to have to make a decision here, that they can't have it both ways, that the gospel is black and white. You know, you got to make a decision. There's no room for compromise. So right away at the beginning of the chapter, he's going to remind them that they are children of God. This kind of is a continuation of last week, chapter 3, where he was talking about, you know, they're heirs with Abraham because of faith, that they're children of God. He says that in verse 4, he says, when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law, and he sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. And so he's talking about that they're adopted into the family of God, even though they might not feel worthy of it because they weren't Jewish. He said, you are worthy of it because God has made you worthy of it. He's adopted you. And so he uses this analogy. He's talking more about adoption. Really, if you think about it, there's a lot of advantages to being a child. And he talks a little bit about that. You know, maybe you know that. You know the negative side of that if you know anyone in sports where their dad's the coach. You know, they get some advantages. You know, they get a little bit of favor, right? Because they're the son. And Paul's saying, he's saying, when you're a son or a daughter of God, there's some great advantages that come along with that. And he's reminding the Galatians, guys, you are a child of God. Don't let these Judaizers tell you any differently. You're a child of God. He's accepted you. He's received you. Don't go back on that. The Galatians were in danger of trading slave masters. He gets into that in verse 8. He said, before you Gentiles knew God, you were slaves to so-called gods that don't even exist. You can check out the article in the library this week talking about how pagans lived 2,000 years ago. And he's basically saying that's how you used to be. You had all these, you were a part of this cult that there was just immorality going on. He explains it later on in Colossians, one of the other letters that he wrote. He explains it in chapter 3 like this. So put to death that sinful earthly nature that lurks within you. Have nothing to do with it. And then he reminds them of what it is. Sexual immorality and impurity and lust and evil desires. He says, don't be greedy. He says, don't worship the things of this world. He says, because of these things, the anger of God is coming. He says, you used to do these things when your life was still part of this world. See, that stuff was sort of built into pagan worship. And today, it's no different, is it? I mean, we still have those kinds of things 2,000 years later. Now, same sin, different idol, We don't worship these little statues, and it's not the Greek and Roman gods, but we all still have sin. Students, you still go to school, and you're forced to make decisions all the time. Are you going to go that way? Are you going to go down that path? And what Paul is saying is he's reminding them that when they came to faith, they turned away from all that stuff. They turned away from that kind of lifestyle. They turned away from their pagan sin and their pagan bondage, their pagan lifestyle. But what's happening now is the Judaizers are coming in, and the Judaizers are trying to enslave them again. Now, they're not trying to enslave them to the stuff they came out of. Now they're trying to enslave them to legalism. And Paul's saying, he says, you're trading, you're in danger of trading bondage. You're in danger of trading slave masters. You left this slave master when you came to faith. You left your old way. You left those old gods. And now the Judaizers are trying to put you in bondage to a different kind of slavery. The slavery of the law, slavery of legalism. He says it like this in verse 9. So now that you know God, or should I say now that God knows you, why do you want to go back again and become slaves once more to the weak and useless spiritual principles of this world? It's like trading addictions. If you know anyone that's struggled with an addiction, a lot of times, someone, if they've got a drug addiction, a lot of times they'll trade out that drug addiction. If they get free from that addiction, they'll trade it out for an alcohol addiction. You're still addicted. Get rid of all kind of slavery. Get rid of all kind of bondage. And that's what Paul's saying. He's saying, don't go from a pagan lifestyle to now a legalistic lifestyle. He's like, bondage is bondage. fact, one of the things you'll talk about in small groups is which one do you think is worse? That'd be a good discussion. And Paul closes the chapter with this. He illustrates the point by talking about Abraham's two children. Now, the first child of Abraham you read about in Genesis 16. His name was Ishmael. And basically what happened is, even though Abraham was super old, God gave him this promise, but he didn't really believe God's promise. And so he tried to take it into his own hands, and he tried to make the promise work. He tried to force the promise by his own actions. And so he married his wife's maidservant, and they had a child, and they named that child Ishmael. And they went around like for 13 years and thought everything was cool. Abraham thought this was the promised child of God. And then God came to him later, and you can read this in Genesis 21, and he says, now I'm going to fulfill my promise. And Abraham's like, well, I already have a child. Now he says, no. That was the one you made happen. That wasn't the one I promised. And so God made Sarah pregnant, even though Sarah and Abraham were like 90 and 100 years old. It was a miracle of God. It was a promise of God. And this is what Paul's saying. Paul's making this point. He's saying Ishmael represents salvation by law, by works. You try to make it happen yourself. You try to force it to happen. Isaac, the second child, Genesis 21, he represents salvation by faith. He represents what God does when you decide to trust God. And that's really Paul's point. And it's the point for us today. He's saying this: you have to make a choice, Galatians, students. You have to make a choice. Are you going to try to be worthy enough for God because of your own works? Are you going to try to force what God has promised? Are you going to try to force it and grab it and take a hold of it by your own works? Or are you going to choose to trust God that what He has promised is still true? When it comes to salvation, you can apply this to a bunch of things in your life. But we talk about this in Truth One and Foundations. We say we start by trusting Jesus. And the first thing that means is that you have to receive His gift by faith. If you've never trusted Jesus for your salvation, maybe today is going to be the day that you're going to do it. Talk about it with your mentor or your small group leader today. And if you've already received Jesus, then you know this, that you need to continually learn from that lesson from Ishmael and Isaac. Continually learn to trust Jesus with every new experience, with every new challenge in life, because God is faithful. Choose to trust in that God.